In the summer of 1914, a young forestry surveyor from the University of Tennessee walked into a hollow the local mountain folk refused to name out loud. He walked out 3 days later without his notebooks, without his compass, and without the ability to speak for the rest of his natural life. He lived another 41 years in a state sanitarium in Knoxville, and in all that time he wrote exactly one sentence on paper, over and over, until the pencil broke through the page. The sentence was, "They are not from here, and they were here first." The hollow he walked into was called Blood Fork. The family living inside it was called the Culpeppers. And what state investigators finally pulled out of that hollow in the fall of 1915 was so far outside the boundaries of what was believed possible in the southern Appalachians that the records were sealed under an obscure state, health provision, and remained sealed for the better part of a century. What follows is the reconstructed account of the Culpepper Clan of Blood Fork, the deepest and most deliberately buried family scandal in the recorded history of the Great Smoky Mountains. It is a story about isolation, about inheritance, about a bloodline that should not have survived, and about a much older question that keeps rising to the surface no matter how many times the mountains try to bury it. Who was living in these hills before the settlers arrived, and what did they leave behind in the people who stayed? Before we walk into that hollow together, do one thing for me. In the comments below, type the name of the county and the state you are watching from tonight. Just the county and the state. The reason I am asking is simple. The pattern you're about to see unfold in Blood Fork was not an isolated event. Versions of it have been quietly recorded in ridge country from northern Georgia all the way up through central Pennsylvania, and every time we run one of these accounts, viewers write in from the exact regions where the parallel cases occurred. Your comment helps the next viewer find the map they are actually standing on. So drop your county and your state below, and then settle in, because what happened in Blood Fork did not stay in Blood Fork. To understand what was found in Blood Fork, you first have to understand what Blood Fork was, because the geography of the place is not incidental to the story. It is arguably the entire story. The hollow itself sits in what is now the northeastern corner of Sevier County, Tennessee, on the ridge system that eventually became part of the national park boundary in the middle 1930s. Before the park existed, and before the Civilian Conservation Corps cut the fire roads that eventually made these ridges accessible, Blood Fork was, for all intents and purposes, unreachable. There was no wagon road into it. There was no rail spur within 20 miles of it. There was one game trail that dropped down from the ridge crest through a stand of old-growth chestnut, and that trail was known only to a handful of hunters and moonshiners, most of whom flatly refused to use it after sundown. The hollow was shaped like a long, narrow bowl, roughly 1.5 miles in length and perhaps 400 yards at its widest point, walled on 3 sides by nearly vertical shale outcroppings that ran up to 800 feet above the floor. At the closed end of the bowl was a spring that fed a fast-running creek, and it was the colour of that creek in certain seasons that gave the place its name. The water ran clear most of the year, but during the spring melt and again after heavy autumn rains, the runoff pulled a mineral called cinnabar out of the exposed shale, and the creek would turn the colour of old blood for anywhere from 3 days to 2 weeks at a stretch. The Cherokee had a name for the hollow, and although the exact word was never transcribed correctly, every mountain family within 30 miles knew that the Cherokee would not enter the place. Not to hunt, not to trap, not to gather, not for any reason. When settlers began pressing into these ridges in the 1790s and early 1800s, the Cherokee guides who worked as translators would walk them right up to the ridge crest above Blood Fork, point down into the bowl, and then turn around and walk back the way they came. They would not descend. Several early journals record that when pressed for a reason, the guides would only say that the hollow belonged to the people who were there before the people. That specific phrasing, the people who were there before the people, appears in 3 separate settler diaries from the 1810s, all from different families who had no contact with one another. It is one of the earliest documented references to what would eventually become the central mystery of the Culpepper case, because it establishes that something was already wrong with Blood Fork long before any white family ever set foot in it. The Culpepper family first appears in the Sevier County tax rolls in the spring of 1821, and the manner of their arrival is worth pausing on, because it does not match the pattern of any other settler family in the surrounding valleys. Most families who pushed into these ridges during that period came in wagon trains, or at minimum in extended kinship groups of a dozen or more, because a single family alone in country like this simply could not survive its first winter. The Culpeppers arrived as a single unit, one man, one woman, and what the county clerk recorded only as several children, no ages given, no names recorded. They arrived on foot. They arrived from the east, which is to say from the direction of the North Carolina line, but no family by that name appears in any North Carolina census of the preceding decade. They arrived carrying almost nothing, and they walked directly into Blood Fork, the one hollow every other family in the region actively avoided, and they filed a homestead claim on it within the week. The man who filed the claim gave his name as Obediah Culpepper. He gave his age as 42. He gave his place of birth as, and this is a direct quote from the original tax ledger, the old country. He did not specify which old country. The clerk who took down the entry, a man named Elias Wembley, added a small note in the margin of the ledger that reads, in his own handwriting, "Subject spoke English with difficulty, and had markings on the backs of both hands which he would not explain." That marginal note is the first recorded physical description of a Culpepper, and every subsequent physical description across the next 90 years will return to those markings. They appear in the census of 1830, described as tattoos of a foreign character. They appear again in the census of 1860, described as raised scars in a pattern resembling script. They appear in the recollections of a travelling Methodist circuit rider in 1878, who wrote in his journal that every Culpepper male he had ever encountered bore what he called the mark, running from the wrist to the elbow on the outside of each forearm, and that when asked about it they would only say it was the sign of the covenant. What covenant they would not say, with whom they would not say. The Methodist rider, whose name was Elder Josiah Hampel, is one of only a handful of outsiders in the entire 19th century who is documented as having spent significant time inside Blood Fork and lived to write about it afterward. His journal, which surfaced in the archives of the East Tennessee Historical Society in 1987, is one of the primary sources for everything we know about the Culpeppers before the 20th century, and it is where the story starts to become genuinely difficult to explain by conventional means. Before we walk into that journal with him, there are two more things about the family's early years in the hollow that need to be laid on the table, because they establish the pattern that everything else will build on. The first is that Obediah Culpepper, from the moment of his arrival, refused to sell any of the land the family had claimed. He was approached, over the course of the next 30 years, by no fewer than 9 separate buyers, including representatives of a Boston timber concern, who offered him what would have been, in the currency of the 1850s, a small fortune for the standing chestnut on the hollow floor. He refused every offer without discussion. He did not haggle. He did not counter. He simply said no and turned away. The second thing worth noting is that the family did not marry out and did not marry in. In the 94 years between their arrival and the state intervention of 1915, not a single Culpepper is recorded as having taken a spouse from any surrounding valley, from any surrounding county, from any church parish, or from any other community of any kind. Not one. The birth records, maintained in the family Bible, show every child of every generation as having been born to 2 Culpepper parents. This was noticed by the local Methodist and Baptist congregations. It was remarked on. It was considered, by the standards of the period, deeply improper. But no one ever pressed the family on the subject, because no one, for reasons that were rarely stated aloud but were universally understood along the ridge country of Sevier County, was willing to raise the matter with a Culpepper directly. Before we move on to the Hampel Journal, stop for a second. What you just heard about the Culpepper markings and the covenant they refuse to explain is the part that changes everything. But it only makes sense when you see it written out next to the original Hampel field notes. The forearm markings, the covenant phrasing, it's all in the document linked below. Take 5 seconds right now, grab it, and then come back. Because what comes next builds directly on it. The link is in the description. QR code is on your screen. Elder Josiah Hampel rode into Blood Fork on the 3rd of October, 1878, on the strength of a letter he had received from a woman named Prudence Culpepper, who identified herself as the youngest daughter of Obediah, then in her late 50s, and who wrote to request a Christian burial for her mother. The letter itself is preserved in the Methodist archives at Emory University, and it is a striking document. The handwriting is precise, the grammar is formal, and the vocabulary is that of a woman who had been educated well beyond what any isolated mountain homestead of the period should have been able to provide. Hampel noted this immediately in his journal. He also noted that the letter had been delivered to the church at Sevierville not by post and not by messenger, but had simply appeared on the altar rail one Sunday morning after the doors had been unlocked. No one had seen it delivered. When Hampel rode into the hollow, following the game trail down from the ridge crest, he described the sensation of descent in terms that any modern reader of anomalous field reports will find immediately familiar. He wrote that the temperature dropped noticeably within the first 100 yards of the descent, which he attributed to elevation, but which was in fact a drop of nearly 15 degrees over a change of only 200 feet. He wrote that the sounds of the forest changed. The birds went quiet. The insects went quiet. He noted specifically that he could no longer hear the wind in the trees above him, even though he could see the tops of the trees moving. He described the light as, and this is his exact phrasing, thickened, as though the air itself had taken on a substance. When he reached the floor of the hollow, he was met by 3 of the Culpepper men who had known he was coming despite the fact that he had told no one of his route. They led him to the main cabin, which he described as being far larger and far older than any structure he had expected to find. It was built of chestnut logs of a diameter that no living chestnut in that region could have provided by the 1870s, and the notching at the corners was of a style he did not recognize from any other Appalachian construction he had seen. Inside the cabin he was introduced to the family. He counted, and this is the number he recorded, 17 individuals living under that single roof, ranging in age from an infant to an elderly woman he estimated at close to 100 years old. That elderly woman was the one he had been called to bury, and she would die 3 nights later without ever having spoken a word in his presence. But before she died, Hampel sat with her for the better part of 2 days, and during that time he made a series of observations about her which he wrote down carefully and which have never been satisfactorily explained. He wrote that her eyes were of a colour he had never seen in a human being before. He described the colour as, and again this is his exact language, the pale green of a copper roof after long weather. He wrote that her hands, though gnarled with age, bore the same forearm markings as her sons and grandsons, and that when he examined them closely by candlelight, he became convinced that the markings were not scars and not tattoos, but something he could not name, something that appeared to sit just under the skin rather than on it or in it. He wrote that on the second afternoon she opened her eyes, looked directly at him, and, without moving her lips, he heard her voice inside his own head, speaking a single sentence in a language he did not recognize. He wrote that, after she died and was buried, and after he had left the hollow and returned to Sevierville, that sentence remained in his memory word for word, though he could not repeat it aloud without becoming physically ill. He never wrote the sentence down. Before we continue with Hampel's account of the family itself, there are 2 additional details from the pre-settlement record of Blood Fork that need to be laid on the table, because both of them will become directly relevant to what he observed in the hollow and to what the state investigators would find inside it 37 years later. The first is that the shale walls of the hollow, when they were examined by a state geological survey team in the late 1860s, were found to contain a concentration of an unusual iron-bearing mineral that produced a measurable local magnetic anomaly. The team's compasses did not spin freely, as they would in 1915, but they did drift noticeably in a specific direction that did not correspond to magnetic north, and the survey team's field notes contain a brief remark that the reading in Blood Fork was, and this is the exact phrasing, unlike any other reading recorded in the state to date. The lead geologist on that survey team, a man named Thaddeus Renshaw, wrote a longer supplementary note to accompany the field observations in which he speculated that the mineral concentration might be the result of a meteoric impact in the prehistoric past, and he asked, in his supplementary note, whether the local Cherokee tradition regarding the hollow might not preserve some folk memory of such an impact. He recommended a follow-up survey. No follow-up survey was ever conducted. The second detail is that the water of the spring at the closed end of the hollow, when it was tested in the 1890s by a University of Tennessee chemistry graduate student conducting an informal regional water survey, was found to contain trace concentrations of 3 elements that had no known local geological source, and that, according to the standard reference works of the period, ought not to have been present in Appalachian groundwater in any measurable quantity. The graduate student, whose thesis project this was not, made a note of the finding, submitted his samples to his advisor for verification, and then, according to the department records, dropped out of the program the following semester and returned home to Ohio, where he took up work in his father's dry goods store and never published on the subject. The samples themselves were misplaced during a departmental move in the early 1900s and have never been located. What Hampel observed inside the cabin over the 11 days of his stay must be read against that geological and hydrological backdrop, because the account he wrote is not the account of a man who was overwhelmed by strangeness. It is the account of a careful observer describing, in measured prose, a set of conditions that any subsequent visitor to the hollow would independently confirm. Hampel stayed in the hollow for 11 days. During that time he made careful observations of the 17 Culpeppers living in the main cabin, and the pages of his journal covering that visit are, without exaggeration, the single most important primary source we have for understanding what the family had become by the last quarter of the 19th century. He noted, first, that the family did not appear to farm in any conventional sense. There were no fields cleared for corn. There were no fenced pastures. There was a small kitchen garden behind the cabin, poorly tended, growing what he identified as pole beans, and a variety of squash he did not recognize. There were no cattle, no hogs, and no chickens. When Hampel asked what the family ate, one of the middle sons, a man named Cyrus, walked him out to a small spring house at the base of the shale wall behind the cabin and opened the door. Inside, Hampel wrote, hanging from iron hooks, were the dressed carcasses of some 15 or 20 animals of a kind he had never seen before. They were not deer, they were not bear, they were not any species of large game native to the southern Appalachians. He described them as, and here his handwriting becomes noticeably shaky, resembling nothing so much as a cross between a very large hound and something that walked on 2 legs, with the pelvis structured for upright locomotion but the shoulders and forelimbs proportioned for 4-legged running. He asked Cyrus what these animals were. Cyrus said only that they were the meat the hollow provided, and that they did not come out during the day. Hampel did not ask a second question. The children of the family concerned him even more. He counted 9 children under the age of 16 living in the cabin, and he noted that none of them attended school, which he expected, but also that none of them appeared to have ever left the hollow, which he did not. He asked one of the older girls, a child of maybe 11 whom he identified only as Elspeth, whether she had ever seen a horse. She looked at him blankly and asked what a horse was. He asked her whether she had ever seen a road. She said she had seen the trail her father used to bring in salt and iron from the outside, but she had never walked more than 100 paces up it. He asked her whether she knew what year it was. She said it was the 52nd year of the covenant, and when he pressed her to say what year that was by the outside calendar, she could not. But she could recite, in a low sing-song voice that Hampel found deeply unsettling, the full names and birth years of every Culpepper who had lived and died in the hollow going back to Abaya, and she could do so without pausing to think. She named 51 people over the course of about 4 minutes. Hampel checked her recitation later against the family Bible, which was kept on a shelf above the hearth, and every name and date she had given was correct. He asked her how she had learned this. She said her grandmother had taught her, sitting by the fire, and that all the children learned it as soon as they could speak. He asked her why. She said because the ones who came before must not be forgotten, and if the naming ever stopped, the covenant would break, and then the hollow would take them all back. Hampel sat with that sentence for a long time before he wrote it down, and when he did write it down, he underlined the phrase, "the hollow would take them all back," 3 times. There is one more encounter from the Hampel stay that has to be included in any honest account of the family, and it involves the wife of Abaya, whose name appears in the record only as Sarai, and who was almost certainly dead by the time Hampel arrived, although the family never spoke of her death directly and no grave for her was ever located inside the hollow. In the entire 50-year period between the family's arrival in 1821 and Sarai's presumed death sometime in the early 1870s, there is exactly one recorded description of her from a source outside the family. It comes from a travelling tinker named Ephraim Bowles, who made an unscheduled stop at the Culpepper cabin in the summer of 1847 to repair a broken kettle. Bowles wrote in a letter to his brother, which survives in a private family collection in Kentucky, that a woman came to the door of the cabin, took the kettle from him, paid him in one of the odd gold coins, and closed the door without speaking. He wrote that, in the moment she stood in the doorway, before the door closed, he had the strong impression that she was not looking at him but through him, at something behind him, and that when he turned around after the door had closed, there was nothing behind him but the trail and the trees. But his horse, which he had left tied to a hitching post 20 paces away, was standing rigidly at attention with all 4 legs braced, staring at the same spot in the trees that the woman had been looking at, and would not be persuaded to move for the better part of an hour. Bowles wrote that after they finally got moving again, his horse would not eat for 3 days. He wrote that, when they reached his brother's farm, the horse walked into the barn, lay down in the straw, and died in the night, and that the veterinary surgeon his brother called out the next morning could find no cause for the death, and simply shook his head and asked Bowles where the horse had been last. When Bowles told him, the surgeon walked out of the barn without another word and refused to accept payment for the visit. Hampel was told about Sarai only obliquely, by Prudence, in the course of a conversation on his 8th evening in the hollow. Prudence told him that her mother had gone back to the door in the last summer of her life, and that the door had received her, and that this was the ordinary way of it for the women of the family who had kept the covenant to the end. Hampel asked her what she meant by the door. Prudence changed the subject. He did not ask a second time. On the 11th morning of his stay, Hampel buried the old woman under a beech tree behind the cabin, read the Methodist committal service over her, and prepared to leave. He wrote that Prudence Culpepper walked with him as far as the base of the game trail, thanked him for his services, and pressed into his hand a small object wrapped in oilcloth. She told him not to open it until he was clear of the ridge crest and safely back on the wagon road toward Sevierville. She told him that it was a payment for what he had done, and that it was also a warning. She told him that he was welcome to write down anything he had seen inside the hollow, but that he should never, under any circumstances, attempt to return, and that if he did return, he would not be permitted to leave a second time. She told him this in a calm, level voice, without any hint of threat, and Hampel wrote that he had believed her completely. When he reached the ridge crest, he sat down on a fallen log and unwrapped the object. It was a coin. It was not any coin he recognized. It was heavier than gold, though it appeared to be gold in color, and its surface was stamped on one side with a symbol he could not identify, a spiral broken by 3 horizontal bars, and on the other side with a line of characters in a script that was neither Latin nor Greek, nor Hebrew nor Cyrillic, nor any of the several Native American syllabaries he had encountered in his years of circuit work. He held the coin in his hand for a long time. Then he wrapped it back up in the oilcloth, put it in his coat pocket, and rode down out of the mountains. He never returned to Blood Fork. But the coin, and this is the detail that has kept researchers coming back to the Hampel Journal for more than a century, was not the only thing he brought out of the hollow. He also brought out an illness, or something that behaved like an illness, though no physician who examined him in the following years could ever put a name to it. Beginning in the winter of 1879, Hampel began to lose weight steadily, at a rate that alarmed his family. He complained of a persistent taste in his mouth, which he described as the taste of cold iron mixed with something sweet, and which never left him for the rest of his life. He began to hear, in the quiet hours of the early morning, a low humming sound that seemed to come from the walls of his own house, and which no one else could hear. He began, by his own account, to dream every night of the hollow, and specifically of the old woman under the beech tree, who in his dreams was not dead, but who was sitting up against the trunk of the tree, with her pale green eyes open and her mouth moving silently, as though she were still trying to tell him the sentence she had spoken into his mind on the second afternoon. Elder Josiah Hampel died on the 14th of March, 1883, at the age of 57, of what the attending physician recorded as cardiac failure of unknown origin. His journal was passed to his eldest son, who read it once and then locked it in a trunk in the attic, and there it sat, unread, for 104 years, until it was found in a storage lot auction in 1987 and eventually made its way into the archives at Emory. The coin was buried with him at his own request. In 1992, a graduate student at the University of Tennessee, doing preliminary work on the Hampel Journal as a dissertation topic, obtained permission from surviving descendants to briefly exhume the coffin and examine the coin. The coin was still there. The characters on its surface were photographed and submitted to the linguistics departments at 3 separate universities. None of them could identify the script. One of them, however, noted that certain individual characters bore a strong resemblance to marks found on a small number of unclassified stone tablets recovered from cave sites in the eastern Anatolian highlands, dated by the researchers who found them to approximately 6,000 years before the Common Era, which is to say, roughly 4,000 years before any human culture is believed to have crossed the Atlantic and settled in the eastern woodlands of North America. There is one further linguistic fragment from the same broad period that has to be included here, because it comes from an entirely independent source and it points, tentatively but unmistakably, in the same direction as the coin. In the summer of 1853, Obadiah Culpepper was approached by a representative of a Boston timber concern, a man named Percival Hogue, who had ridden into Sevierville with instructions to acquire standing chestnut in commercial quantities. Hogue had done his homework. He knew that the largest stand of old-growth chestnut in the county stood on the floor of Blood Fork. He arranged an introduction through a Sevierville shopkeeper, made the descent into the hollow with his interpreter, presented Obadiah with what would have been, in the currency of the period, a genuinely substantial offer, and was refused without discussion. He was refused a second time, more curtly, 6 months later. He wrote about the second refusal in his own business journal, which survives in a corporate archive in Massachusetts, and the passage is worth quoting because it contains the only piece of language, other than the coin script, that has ever been recorded from a Culpepper source in an unidentified tongue. Hogue wrote that Obadiah had told him that the trees in Blood Fork were not for sale to the outside, because the trees in Blood Fork did not belong to Obadiah, and never had. Hogue asked him who the trees did belong to. Obadiah answered him with a single word, which Hogue transcribed phonetically because he did not recognize it, and which reads, in Hogue's careful handwriting, Keth Karu. Hogue noted in the margin that the word was spoken with the tone of a proper name, and that Obadiah would not repeat it or explain it. That word, Keth Karu, is not Cherokee, it is not English. It is not Scots Gaelic, which was the language of a significant portion of the settler population in the region. It has been submitted, over the last several decades, to linguistic identification by researchers who have run it against every major and minor language family for which comparative data is available. It has never been identified. The closest partial match anyone has ever produced, and this is a match that no serious linguist will stand behind, comes from a reconstructed proto-vocabulary associated with a set of Highland dialects spoken in the same region of eastern Anatolia from which the coin script appears to have originated. The proto-vocabulary contains a term reconstructed as Ket Karu, meaning, in the most cautious translation offered by the researcher who proposed it, those who remain behind after the going. What Obadiah told Percival Hogue on that summer afternoon in 1853, if the tentative reconstruction is accepted, is that the trees in Blood Fork did not belong to him. They belonged to those who had remained behind after the going. He did not say who had gone. He did not say where they had gone. He did not say when they were coming back. Between the death of Hampel in 1883 and the arrival of the university surveyor in the summer of 1914, there is a period of 31 years in the Culpepper record which is often described by researchers as the silent decades. It is not, in fact, silent. It is simply the case that the surviving documentation from this period consists almost entirely of rumours, sightings, and second-hand accounts, none of which can be verified against a primary source, and most of which were written down decades after the fact by people who had reason to exaggerate or misremember. But there is enough of it, and it is consistent enough across independent sources that a rough outline of what was happening inside Blood Fork during those years can be reconstructed with reasonable confidence. The first thing that appears to have happened is that the family stopped coming out. Prior to Hampel's visit, the Culpepper men had made an irregular practice of appearing in Sevierville perhaps 2 or 3 times a year, always in pairs, always on foot, always to trade what they described as roots and pelts for salt, iron nails, and gunpowder. They were remembered by the shopkeepers of that period as courteous, quiet, and physically striking, and they always paid in the same odd gold coins that Hampel would later carry out of the hollow himself. After 1883, those visits stopped. No Culpepper is recorded in any Sevierville business ledger for the entire decade of the 1890s. The second thing that appears to have happened is that the surrounding population began to record a rise in what they described as strange sounds coming out of Blood Fork after dark. Farmers on the ridges above the hollow reported hearing what one of them called a chanting, low and rhythmic and always in a language he did not recognize, carrying up out of the bowl on still nights, sometimes for hours at a stretch. The chanting was reported most often in the weeks around the spring and autumn equinoxes, and it was reported often enough by enough different families over a long enough period that by the middle 1890s the ridges above Blood Fork had become a place that no local person would knowingly camp near. The third thing that appears to have happened is that livestock began to disappear from the farms nearest the hollow. Not many, and not often, but consistently. A milk cow here, a sow there, a mule that had been staked out to graze and was found the next morning with the stake pulled clean out of the ground and no tracks leading away in any direction. In no case were remains ever found. In no case were the tracks of any known predator ever identified at the scene. The disappearances were spaced far enough apart and involved animals valuable enough to make the losses hurt, but not catastrophic enough to force a coordinated response. And after a decade or so, the farms nearest the hollow simply moved their livestock further down the valley and stopped keeping animals within a mile of the ridge crest. There is a piece of oral tradition from this period, collected in the 1930s as part of a WPA folklore survey of Sevier County, that bears mentioning here because it has the character of a folk memory hardening around something the community could not otherwise process. Several elderly informants, interviewed separately, told the WPA field workers that in the 1890s there had been a period during which the ridges above Blood Fork were watched, on certain nights, by figures that stood at the crest and looked down into the bowl but never descended. The informants disagreed on how tall the figures were and on whether they were shaped like men or shaped like something else, but they agreed on 2 details. They agreed that the figures always appeared on nights when the chanting was rising out of the hollow, and they agreed that the figures always turned before dawn and walked back down the eastern slope of the ridge in the direction of the deeper mountains, and were never seen again until the next such night. The WPA field workers noted, in a marginal comment attached to the transcribed interviews, that the informants had not been in contact with one another before the interviews were conducted, and that the consistency of the account across 3 separate townships was, in the field workers' judgment, striking. The fourth thing that appears to have happened, and this is the piece of the silent decades that has generated the most speculation among modern researchers, is that the Culpepper family appears to have grown. In the year of Hampel's visit, there were 17 individuals living in the main cabin. When the university surveyor descended into the hollow in 1914, he made a rough estimate, based on the number of distinct voices he heard and the number of separate cook fires he saw, of somewhere between 40 and 50. In 36 years, in a family that took no wives from outside, that permitted no marriages beyond the hollow, that received no outside blood whatsoever, the population had roughly tripled. There is only one way that could happen, and it is precisely because there is only one way it could happen that the state of Tennessee, when it finally sent investigators into Blood Fork in the fall of 1915, sealed the resulting files under the health provision that would keep them buried for the next 93 years. The young man who walked into Blood Fork in the summer of 1914 was named Wendell Cross. He was 23 years old. He had just completed his junior year at the University of Tennessee, where he was studying forestry, and he had accepted a summer contract with the State Land Office to map the timber resources of the eastern ridges in preparation for what would eventually become the national park. He was an experienced hiker, he was a competent surveyor, and he had grown up in the foothills of the Smokies, which meant that he was well aware of the local reputation of Blood Fork and had, by his own written account submitted to his supervisor before the trip, planned to skirt the hollow entirely and simply mark its rough boundaries from the ridge crest. What actually happened on the 21st of June, 1914, is known to us in some detail because Cross carried 2 notebooks with him into the mountains, one for his official survey work and one that he kept as a personal field journal. The official notebook was found on the ridge crest above Blood Fork on the 24th of June, when a search party sent out by his supervisor discovered his compass, his canteen, and his official notebook laid out neatly on a flat rock at the head of the game trail. The personal journal was not with them. It was found, 6 weeks later, tied in a bundle of oilcloth and tucked into the hollow of a beech tree at the base of the trail, and it had been left there, deliberately, by someone who wanted it to be found. The last entry in the personal journal is dated the 21st of June and was written, based on the light referenced in the entry, sometime in the late afternoon of that day. The handwriting is Cross's, but it has changed noticeably from the earlier entries in the same journal. It is looser, larger, and it slopes downward across the page in a way that suggests the writer was under considerable stress. The entry reads as follows, and I am going to give it to you in full, because it is the only first-hand contemporary account we have of what a person walking into Blood Fork actually experienced in the moment. I have been walking now for perhaps 2 hours since I left the ridge. The trail was easier than I expected at first, but has become steeper and the light is going strange. The sun should still be well above the western wall, but I cannot see it. I can see the wall, and I can see the sky above the wall, but the light in the hollow is coming from somewhere else. It is coming from the ground. I do not know how else to describe it. The moss on the stones is faintly glowing. The bark of the trees is faintly glowing. My own hands, when I hold them out in front of me, are faintly glowing. There is a sound I cannot place. It is not a chant, but it is not silence either. It is as though the air itself is humming at a note just below what I can hear. I met a man on the trail about a quarter-mile back. He was tall and thin, and he had the marks on his forearms that Elder Hampel described in the account I read at the library last winter. He did not speak. He looked at me and he smiled, and he stepped aside to let me pass. I did not want to pass, but my feet kept walking. I am writing this now because I have stopped for a moment at a bend in the trail, and I am not sure I will be able to stop again. If someone finds this book, please tell my mother I love her, and please do not come looking for me. Do not come down into this hollow. Whatever they tell you about me, do not come. The entry ends there. Wendell Cross was not seen again for 3 days. On the morning of the 24th of June, he was found on the wagon road just outside the town of Cosby, roughly 11 miles from the mouth of Blood Fork, walking barefoot in the middle of the road. His clothes were intact, but were soaked through with what turned out to be creek water. His hair had gone completely white. His eyes, according to the farmer who found him and who knew him well from having sold his mother butter at market, had changed colour. They had been brown before he went into the mountains. When he came out, they were, and here we have the phrasing from the farmer's own deposition to the sheriff, the pale green of a copper roof after long weather. He was carrying nothing. He could not speak. When spoken to, he would open his mouth, and his lips would move, but no sound would come out. He was taken by wagon to the county hospital in Newport, where he was examined by 3 physicians over the course of a week. They found him to be physically unharmed. His weight was normal, his temperature was normal, his heart rate was normal, and there were no injuries or signs of exposure that would have been consistent with a man who had been lost in the mountains for 3 days. But he could not speak, he could not write, and he could not, when tested, seem to comprehend what was being said to him. He was, for all practical purposes, mentally absent. He was transferred in the fall of that year to the State Sanitarium in Knoxville, and he lived there, in a private room on the 2nd floor, for the next 41 years. He never regained the ability to speak. He never left the grounds of the sanitarium. He never received a visitor after his mother died in 1926. He ate the food that was placed in front of him. He slept when he was told to sleep. He rose when he was told to rise. And for 8 hours a day, every day, for 41 years, he sat at a small desk by the window of his room, and he wrote. The staff at the sanitarium kept the pages he produced, at first out of a hope that they might contain something diagnostically useful, and later, as the years wore on, out of a growing sense that they were witnessing something they did not understand. The pages, when they were finally counted after his death in 1955, numbered just under 14,000. Every single page contained the same sentence, written in Cross's own handwriting, over and over, from the top of the page to the bottom. They are not from here, and they were here first. That was the only thing he ever wrote. It was the only thing he ever communicated in any form during 41 years of institutional confinement. And it is the sentence that eventually, in the summer of 1915, when the State Health Commission reviewed the file that had accumulated on Cross's case and cross-referenced it against 3 other missing person reports from the ridges around Blood Fork over the preceding decade, prompted the Commission to authorize a formal investigation of the Culpepper homestead. That investigation was conducted between the 2nd and the 17th of October, 1915. The team consisted of 4 state investigators, 2 Sevier County deputies, a physician from the Newport Hospital, and a Cherokee interpreter who was hired at the last minute at the specific request of the lead investigator, a man named Marcus Thorne, who had grown up in Cock County and who understood, better than his colleagues from Nashville, exactly what kind of place they were walking into. Marcus Thorne was 47 years old in the autumn of 1915. He had served 8 years as a criminal investigator for the state of Tennessee, and before that he had served 12 years as a sheriff's deputy in his home county. He was, by every account we have of him, a serious man who did not spook easily, who was not given to speculation, and who considered his written reports to be his single most important professional product. The report he filed on the Blood Fork investigation, which ran to 283 typed pages, plus more than 40 pages of photographic plates, was submitted to the State Health Commission on the 29th of October, 1915. Within 72 hours of its submission, it had been withdrawn from the Commission's active files, sealed under the emergency public health provision that governed matters of communicable disease, and transferred to a locked storage room in the basement of the state capitol in Nashville. It remained there, effectively invisible to public inquiry, until a Freedom of Information request filed by a Vanderbilt historian in 2008 succeeded in dislodging it, along with the accompanying photographic evidence, into the public archives. What Thorne and his team found in Blood Fork over those 15 days in October of 1915 is the reason the file was sealed. They descended into the hollow on the morning of the 2nd, following the same game trail that Hampel had used, and that Cross had used, and their descent is described in Thorne's report in terms that closely mirror the earlier accounts. He noted the temperature drop, he noted the silence of the forest, he noted the quality of the light, and he noted one additional thing that neither Hampel nor Cross had lived long enough or lucidly enough to record, which is that his compass, which had been functioning normally on the ridge crest, began to spin freely on its pivot within the first 300 yards of the descent, and did not stabilize again until his team climbed back out to the ridge crest 15 days later. When the team reached the floor of the hollow, they were met by no one. The main cabin, which Hampel had described in his journal, was still standing, but it had been enlarged, substantially enlarged. Thorne counted and photographed a total of 9 separate structures arranged in a rough semicircle around the original cabin, all built in the same style of chestnut log construction, all showing evidence of significant age, and all appearing to be inhabited. Smoke was rising from 6 of the 9 chimneys. There were tools laid out on workbenches under several of the porches. There were sheets and clothing hanging on lines strung between the buildings. And there was, and Thorne noted this with particular care, no sign whatsoever of any adult male member of the Culpepper family. He would later determine, through interviews conducted over the next several days, that every adult male in the clan, 31 individuals in total, had left the hollow 3 days before the investigation team's arrival, and had travelled together, on foot, up over the ridge crest and down into the deeper wilderness of what would eventually become the park's most remote backcountry, a region even today that is entered by only a handful of experienced hikers each year. They had known somehow that the investigators were coming. They had left together before the investigators arrived, and they never came back. Not one of them. In the more than a century that has passed since the Thorne investigation, Not a single adult male Culpepper who left the hollow in the last week of September 1915 has ever been definitively accounted for. Their names, all 31 of them, appear on a list that is included as an appendix to the Thorne report. Every one of those names has been cross-checked over the decades against death records, arrest records, military enlistment records, and property records for the entire eastern half of the United States. Not one match has ever been found. What Thorne found waiting for him in the hollow, in place of the men, was the rest of the family. He counted and photographed for identification purposes 42 individuals. 27 of them were children under the age of 16. 15 of them were women, ranging in age from a young mother of maybe 19 to an elderly matriarch who claimed to be 104 years old and who bore, in Thorne's careful description, a striking physical resemblance to the woman Hampel had buried under the beech tree 37 years earlier. The 42 individuals were compliant, courteous, and to a person almost eerily calm about the arrival of the investigators. They fed the team. They provided sleeping quarters in 2 of the outbuildings. They answered questions, when questions were asked, in careful, formal English that struck every member of the team as being at odds with the isolated backwoods setting they had walked into. And they allowed the investigators to move through the compound freely, to inspect every building, to photograph every room, and to examine every object they cared to examine. What emerged from that inspection, over the course of 15 days, is the substance of the Thorne report and the reason the report was sealed. The physical evidence of extreme inbreeding was extensive and undeniable. The physician on the team, Dr. Ernest Whitfield of the Newport Hospital, conducted informal examinations of every member of the extended family who would consent to be examined, and his findings, appended to the Thorne report as a separate medical annex, describe a population showing consistent physical markers associated with many generations of first cousin and closer unions. He noted a shared jaw structure, a shared set of dental abnormalities, a shared pattern of extra digits on the hands and feet, a shared and unusually high incidence of certain eye colours and hair textures. But he also noted, and this is the finding that makes the Whitfield Annex genuinely strange, that the population was not showing the pattern of cognitive and developmental impairment that a geneticist of the period would have absolutely predicted from that degree of inbreeding sustained over that many generations. The children were intelligent, alert, and articulate. The adults were physically healthy, mentally sharp, and functionally capable. The oldest members of the clan appeared to be aging at a rate significantly slower than expected. Whitfield, who was a competent and unsentimental physician, wrote in his private notes, which were attached to the annex and later included in the sealed file, that in his professional judgment the Culpepper population appeared to represent, and this is his phrasing, a genetic line that has stabilized around a pattern which should not, by any reasonable standard, be stable. He offered no explanation for this observation. He simply noted it and moved on. The material evidence recovered from the compound was, if anything, stranger than the medical evidence. In the loft of the main cabin, the team found a collection of books, some 300 volumes in all, bound in leather that had darkened with age, written in what appeared to be 4 different scripts, none of which the Cherokee interpreter or any member of the investigative team could identify. In a locked chest under the floor of the largest outbuilding, they found 71 of the same gold coins that Hampel had carried out of the hollow in 1878, all bearing the same spiral symbol and the same untranslated line of characters. In a small stone-lined chamber cut into the base of the shale wall behind the compound, accessible only through a low crawl space, they found what Thorne described as an assemblage of objects, the purpose of which he could not determine, but which included plates of a metal his team could not identify, arranged in a specific geometric pattern on the floor of the chamber, and which produced, when the team's photographer set his flash tray inside the chamber, a strong static discharge that knocked him briefly unconscious and damaged the flash apparatus beyond repair. The photograph he had been attempting to take, however, developed successfully. It is included in the Thorne file, and what it shows on the floor of that chamber, arranged around the metal plates, is a series of what appear to be markings identical, in symbol and in sequence, to the markings that had been reported on the forearms of every adult male Culpepper for the previous 94 years. On the 11th day of the investigation, Thorne conducted a formal interview with the elderly matriarch of the clan. Her name, according to the family Bible and confirmed by her own statement, was Millicent Culpepper, and she was, again by her own statement, 104 years old. If that was true, she had been born in the year the family arrived in Blood Fork, which would have made her one of the original children Obadiah walked in with in 1821. The interview lasted just under 6 hours, was conducted with the Cherokee interpreter present, although she chose to speak in English throughout, and was transcribed in full by one of the state investigators. The transcript runs to 78 pages of the sealed file. It is one of the most extraordinary documents in the American historical record of the 20th century, and the fact that it has been publicly available since 2008 and remains almost completely unknown outside of a very small circle of researchers is itself a story worth telling, but not tonight. Tonight, what matters is what Millicent Culpepper told Marcus Thorne over the course of those 6 hours. She told him that her father Abiah was not born in the country the settlers called the United States. She told him that Obadiah had come across the great water as a young man, and that he had come not from the country the English called their homeland, and not from any of the countries of the European continent, but from a place further east, from a place beyond the mountains that the Turks now called their own, from a place that had been very old already when the Roman armies first pushed into the Levant, and that had been older still when the Roman armies had gone. She told him that her family was one of the last remaining lines of what she called the Keepers, and that the Keepers had been driven, over many generations, by many different empires, further and further west, until at last a handful of them had crossed the great water and had come to the eastern edge of what they had been told was a new and empty country. She told him that the country was not new, and it was not empty, that the country was in fact very old, and had been settled long ago by a people who were kin to her own people, and that the mountains of what were now called the Appalachians were one of the last places on the earth where the old order still held, if you knew how to find it, and if you knew how to speak to what was still living inside it. She told him that Blood Fork was one of those places. She told him that her father had known this before he ever set foot in Tennessee, that he had been led to the hollow by a knowledge older than any map, and that when he had arrived at the ridge crest above the bowl and had looked down into it for the first time, he had wept, because he had recognized it. She told Thorne that what was at the closed end of the hollow, at the source of the spring that fed the blood-coloured creek, was not a spring. She told him that it was a door. She told him that the door had been open before the settlers came, and open before the Cherokee came, and open before the peoples the Cherokee called the Old People came, and that it had been open for a length of time that could not be measured in human generations. She told him that the covenant her father had spoken of, the covenant marked on the forearms of every man in the family, was a covenant with the door and with what lay on the other side of it, and that the terms of the covenant were simple. The family would remain in the hollow. The family would not intermarry with the outside. The family would say the names of the dead at every equinox, and in return, the family would be permitted to live for as long as they kept the covenant, and would be provided for by the hollow, and would be watched over by those who came through the door in the season when the door was open. She told Thorne that the door had been open in the summer of 1914, when the young forestry surveyor had walked down the trail, and that the men who had left the compound in the last week of September had left because the door was open again, and because it was their turn to walk through it, as their fathers had walked through it, and their grandfathers, and every generation of Culpepper men since the family had first descended into the hollow 94 years earlier. Marcus Thorne did not know, when he sat across from Millicent Culpepper in the front room of the main cabin on the afternoon of the 12th of October, 1915, what to make of any of it. He was a state investigator from Nashville. He was accustomed to interviewing moonshiners and cattle thieves and the occasional murderer. He was not equipped, by training or by temperament, to evaluate a testimony that placed the ancestral origin of a Tennessee mountain family in the highlands east of Anatolia several thousand years before the historical record of that region began. He simply wrote down what she said. He asked her, at one point, whether she could show him where the door was. She told him that she could not. She told him that only the men could approach the door, and that the men had gone. She told him that even if she could show him, she would not, because the door did not open for those who had not made the covenant, and that if he attempted to force the issue, the door would not harm him but the hollow would, and that his team would not leave. Thorne wrote in the margin of his notes. Next to this exchange, the single word believed. What Thorne could not have known, and what modern researchers of the Culpepper case have only begun to piece together in the last 2 decades, is that the geography Millicent Culpepper described in that interview corresponds with startling precision to the eastern edge of a landmass that appears on European maps of the 15th and 16th centuries under a name that was almost entirely erased from cartographic use by the middle of the 19th century. That name is Tartaria. Tartaria, as it was drawn on maps by cartographers working in Amsterdam and Antwerp and Venice from roughly the year 1400 to roughly the year 1800, was an enormous territory stretching from the Caspian Sea in the west across the steppes and highlands of Central Asia to the Pacific coast, and it was populated, according to those same maps, by peoples that European geographers described in terms that ranged from the merely exotic to the openly supernatural. The maps show cities that never appear in any subsequent atlas. The maps show mountain ranges that do not match the modern surveys. The maps show, at the eastern edge of Tartaria, a series of features labelled with words that translate roughly as the walls of the ancient ones and the places where the sky is thin. The academic consensus regarding these maps is that they represent a mixture of poor geographic knowledge, mythological tradition, and the deliberate falsification of trade routes by cartographers who did not want their competitors to know the real lay of the land. That consensus is not unreasonable. It is also not the only possible explanation. There is a small but growing body of independent researchers who have argued, over the last 30 years or so, that the Tartaria of the old maps corresponds to a real civilization that existed, was populous, was technologically capable, and was systematically erased from the historical record over the course of the 18th and 19th centuries in a coordinated program of cartographic revision and educational reform. The evidence they cite is circumstantial, but it is voluminous, and it includes architectural anomalies in cities from St. Petersburg to San Francisco, the widespread 19th century practice of intentionally burying ground floors of older buildings under fill dirt in what are now called mud flood sites, and a consistent pattern of surviving oral traditions among isolated rural populations across Eurasia and North America that describe an older order of things which was displaced by the modern world within recent enough memory to still be spoken of by grandmothers. What Millicent Culpepper told Marcus Thorne on that October afternoon in 1915, when it is placed alongside the material evidence recovered from Bloodfork and the linguistic evidence of the coin script and the physical evidence of the covenant markings, fits inside that alternative history with an almost uncomfortable precision. Her family, by her own account, was a remnant of a displaced people who had once lived at the eastern edge of a great and now vanished territory, and who had been driven west across the great water into the mountains of a new continent that turned out to be older than the settlers thought it was, and that turned out to contain, in places like Bloodfork, structural remnants of the same order of things her ancestors had known in the highlands beyond Anatolia. On the 17th of October, Marcus Thorne concluded his investigation and walked his team back up the game trail to the ridge crest. Millicent Culpepper walked with him as far as the base of the trail, exactly as Prudence Culpepper had walked with elder Josiah Hampel 37 years earlier. She did not press a gold coin into his hand. She told him only that his report would be filed, and that the state would do what states do, and that in the end it would not matter, because the covenant would keep itself, and the door would keep itself, and the hollow would keep the family for as long as the family was willing to be kept. She was correct on almost every count. The Thorne report was filed. It was sealed within 72 hours, and the state of Tennessee, acting on the medical annex prepared by Dr. Ernest Whitfield and on the emergency public health provisions available to it, moved in the first week of November 1915 to remove the surviving members of the Culpepper Clan from Bloodfork and to disperse them, individually and in small groups, to state institutions and to distant foster placements from which they were unlikely to re-establish contact with one another. The 42 individuals Thorne had counted were taken from the hollow by wagon and by rail over the course of 11 days. The 27 children were placed in orphanages in 6 different states, none of them adjacent to Tennessee, and their surnames were changed on the placement documents to prevent tracing. The 15 women, Millicent Culpepper among them, were committed to state care facilities in Tennessee, Kentucky, and Virginia. Millicent was transferred to the same sanitarium in Knoxville, where Wendell Cross was, at that time, entering his 2nd year of silence and his 2nd year of writing the same sentence over and over at the small desk by his window. She died in that sanitarium in the spring of 1917, at what would have been the age of 106, and the attending physician who signed her death certificate, who was the same physician who was still overseeing Cross's care, wrote in his private notes on the day of her death that she had told him, 3 days before she died, that she was going home. He wrote that he had asked her what she meant. She had told him that the door was closing for the season, but that when it opened again, in the year the mountain remembered, she would walk through it, because those who had made the covenant were carried back to the hollow at the last, no matter where their bodies had been laid. She had told him that he could bury her wherever the state cared to bury her, and it would not matter. She had told him that she had never really left. The compound in Blood Fork was ordered burned by the state in the last week of November 1915. A team of 4 men from the state land office was assigned the task. 3 of them refused to descend the trail. The 4th descended alone, poured kerosene inside each of the 9 structures, set them alight, and walked back up out of the hollow in the falling dusk. He reported to his supervisor, on his return to Sevierville, that the fires had caught cleanly and that the compound was fully involved when he left the ridge. A survey team sent back to confirm the destruction 2 months later, in the middle of January 1916, found no evidence that any structure in Blood Fork had ever burned. The 9 buildings were still standing. Snow lay on the roofs. There was no soot on the walls. There was no scorching of the surrounding vegetation. There was no ash on the ground. The buildings simply stood, empty, as though they had never been touched. The team did not go inside. They photographed the compound from the ridge crest and returned to Sevierville. Those photographs are the last images we have of the Culpepper buildings in place. When a second survey team returned to the hollow in the spring of 1918, more than 2 years later, the 9 buildings were gone. There was no rubble, there was no foundation. There was no evidence, on the floor of the hollow, that any human structure had ever stood in that location. The team found only the beech tree behind the site of the original cabin, and beneath the beech tree they found the grave Elder Josiah Hampel had dug for the elderly woman he had buried there in 1878. The grave was open. It was empty. It looked, according to the report the team filed, as though it had never been filled in. The story might have ended there, with the empty grave and the vanished buildings, if not for a series of loose ends that have surfaced steadily over the past century and that continue to surface today. The 27 children who were dispersed to orphanages in 6 different states in the winter of 1915 were tracked, in a preliminary way, by a Vanderbilt research team in 2010, after the Thorn file became available under the Freedom of Information request. Of the 27, the researchers were able to trace 19 through orphanage placement records, subsequent adoptions, marriages, and eventual deaths. 12 of the 19 lived out apparently ordinary lives and died of ordinary causes. 7 of the 19, however, disappeared from the public record at some point between the ages of 15 and 22. In every one of those 7 cases, the last documented location of the individual was within 70 miles of the Great Smoky Mountains. In every one of those 7 cases, the disappearance was recorded during the last week of September of the year in question, which is the same week in which the men had left Blood Fork in 1915. The remaining 8 of the original 27 have no traceable record after their initial placement, meaning they may have died young, may have changed their names again, or may simply have vanished before the paper trail could catch them. The children of those 19 traced individuals, and the grandchildren of them, and the great-grandchildren, have not been systematically tracked, but a handful of preliminary genealogical searches conducted by independent researchers have turned up individuals in the current living population who share, through documented descent, a bloodline traceable to the Blood Fork clan. Some of those individuals have been contacted. Most of them have not responded to inquiries. A small number have responded, and the ones who have responded have consistently reported the same three things. They have reported unexplained forearm markings in the male line of their family, appearing in early adolescence, always in the same general pattern, resembling raised script rather than tattoo or scar. They have reported dreams, beginning in the same period of adolescence, of a hollow they have never visited, walled on three sides by shale, with a creek running through it that sometimes runs the colour of blood. And they have reported, always in the same week of late September, a feeling they describe as a pull coming from somewhere to the east, that they do not act on but that they cannot fully explain to themselves. Whether any of these modern descendants have ever quietly acted on the pull, whether any of them have walked into the Smokies in the last week of September of any recent year and descended a game trail that would lead them into a hollow that is still, on the current national park topographic maps, marked as inaccessible wilderness, is not known. The Park Service does not report on individual hikers who enter and do not exit the backcountry unless a formal missing persons report is filed. The park is more than 800 square miles in size, and its most remote sectors are entered by only a handful of people each year. Blood Fork, which appears on the modern maps under a different name that I am not going to give you tonight, is one of those most remote sectors. The last confirmed human descent into the hollow, for which we have a written record, was made by a team of 4 graduate students from the University of Tennessee in the summer of 2016, and they turned back within 200 yards of the ridge crest, citing what one of them described in her subsequent field notes as a feeling of being watched from below by something that did not want them to come down. They did not descend. They walked back to their vehicles, drove out of the park, and none of them has published on the subject since. The Thorn file remains in the State Archives in Nashville. The Hample Journal remains at Emory. The photographs from the sealed report, including the one that shows the markings on the floor of the stone-lined chamber, are available to any researcher who cares to request them. The gold coin buried with Elder Josiah Hample remains, presumably, in his grave in the Methodist Cemetery in Sevierville. The door, if there is a door, remains at the closed end of the hollow at the source of the spring that feeds the blood-coloured creek, and it opens, according to the only source we have on the subject, in the year the mountain remembers, which the source did not further specify. There is a temptation, when a story like this reaches its end, to want a resolution, to want the mystery flattened out into something the modern mind can shelve alongside its other explained things. It is a natural impulse, and it is one I have felt myself. In the years I have spent working through the sealed file and the Hample Journal and the accounts of the surveyors and the fragments of testimony from the descendants who have chosen to speak, I do not have a resolution to offer you tonight. I do not know who the Culpeppers really were. I do not know where Obadiah walked from before he descended into that hollow in the spring of 1821. I do not know what covenant was cut into the skin of every man in his line for the next 94 years, or with whom that covenant was made, or what the terms of it were on the other side. I do not know what walked up out of the stone-lined chamber behind the compound on the nights the ridge farmers heard chanting carrying up out of the bowl. I do not know where 31 men went, on foot, in the last week of September 1915, and I do not know why not one of them has ever surfaced in a public record in the century since. I do not know how 9 timbered buildings on the floor of a walled hollow can be set alight by a state land officer in November, still be standing untouched in January, and then be simply gone by the following spring, leaving no rubble and no ash and no foundation. I do not know why a grave dug and filled in 1978 was found open and empty 40 years later. I do not know what the door is, or whether it is a door in any sense we would recognize, or whether it stands open now, on the night you are watching this, at the closed end of a hollow in the eastern Smokies that appears on the current park maps under a name I did not give you and will not give you. What I know is what the record contains, and I have tried to give it to you tonight as faithfully as I am able. The record contains a family that arrived out of nowhere, that lived in a place no one else would live, that produced children who should not have been produced, that kept a covenant no one outside the family understood, and that vanished in a manner that the state of Tennessee found sufficiently disturbing to seal for the better part of a century. The record contains a language on a coin that predates any confirmed transatlantic contact by 4,000 years. The record contains a geography that fits, uncomfortably, inside a name that was scrubbed from the maps in the last 200 years. The record contains a set of markings on the floor of a stone chamber that match the markings on the arms of men whose bodies were never recovered. And the record contains, in the sanitarium in Knoxville, 14,000 pages written by a young forestry surveyor who walked into the wrong hollow on the wrong summer afternoon and came out unable to say anything else, ever, for the rest of his life, except one sentence. They are not from here, and they were here first. There is one more thing I want to leave you with before I let you go, because I think it matters, and I think it is the reason accounts like the Culpepper file are quietly finding their way back into public view after being buried for so long. The story of Blood Fork is not the story of an isolated backwoods anomaly. It is not the story of a family that got weird because it lived too far from town. If it were only that, the state of Tennessee would not have moved to seal the file within 72 hours of its submission, and the state land office would not have dispatched a burn team that could not, in the end, actually destroy what it had been sent to destroy, and the descendants would not still be reporting, more than 100 years later, the same 3 markers passed down through a bloodline that was supposed to have been scattered and forgotten by 1916. The story of Blood Fork is the story of what happens when a piece of an older world is left standing inside the borders of the newer one, and when a family agrees, for reasons of their own, to become the caretakers of that piece for as long as their line holds. Those caretakers existed in the highlands of Eurasia before they crossed the Great Water. They existed in the ridge country of the southern Appalachians for at least a century after they arrived. And if the accounts of the modern descendants are anything to go by, some fragment of the arrangement they made is still holding, in some form, in some line, somewhere in the eastern United States tonight. The mountains do not forget the covenants that were made on them. The men who made those covenants understood that. The states that later inherited the land pretended not to. But the record, when you read it carefully, does not permit the pretense to hold. If you take one thing from this account tonight, take that sentence and sit with it for a moment before you scroll on, because it was not written by a man who was trying to be believed. It was written by a man who no longer had a choice about what he wrote. If this account moved you the way it has moved me, hit the subscribe button before you go, and turn on the notification bell, because next week we are walking into the record of another family in a hollow in northern Vermont that did not vanish in 1915, and whose descendants are, as best we can tell, still living in the same house their ancestors built, still keeping a version of the same covenant, still watching the woodline at the same hour of the same week every autumn. That story is coming next week. I will see you on the ridge when it opens.